The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Thomas. These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded. And he said, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." Jesus says, those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel and will rule over all. And when they rule, they will rest. Jesus says, if your leaders say to you, "Look, the Father's imperial rule is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the Father's imperial rule is inside you and among you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you live in poverty, and you are the poverty. Jesus says, a person old in days won't hesitate to ask a little child 7 days old about the place of life, and that person will live. Because many of the first will be last, and the last first, and will become a single one. Jesus says, know what is in front of your face, and what is hidden from you will then be disclosed. For there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed, and there is nothing buried that will not be raised. The Gospel of the Lord. Any of you who are long-term meditators will know that 95% of the time, meditation is a royal pain in the tuchus. You're just sitting, trying to keep your mind undistracted. And then 5% of the time, extraordinary things happen. So I want to share just one of them with you that I've shared it once before. It was a visionary experience I had about 6 years ago in a very powerful meditation. And in this particular vision, I saw an image of a pregnant woman, a very, very pregnant woman, really, really, really big. Except I could actually see into her tummy. And what I saw was, the mother was the universe, and the baby inside was planet Earth. And as I watched her, occasionally she looked absolutely vibrant and vital and alive, and her eyes were sparkling. And then occasionally she looked wan and listless and drawn. And I wondered what was causing the difference. And then at some stage I realized that instead of there being a single umbilical cord attaching the baby to the mother or the planet to the universe, there were 6.5 billion different umbilical cords. And there was liquid coursing through these. And I realized, of course, that what a mother does for her unborn baby is that she feeds it from her own blood supply, she's giving it nutrients, and her own hormones, her own biochemistry are affecting the emotional being of the child. But she's also eliminating toxic matter and waste matter from the baby. And so there's this balance between the two of them. And one of the reasons women get often morning sickness in the first trimester is that their body is getting used to eliminating the toxins of the baby, and they're holding it in their own blood supply, so that to get rid of that. So there's a balance between the health of the mother and the health of the baby. Obviously, if the mother is not very, very healthy, she can't make a healthy baby. But equally, if the child is seriously defective in some way, it affects the mother's health. So there's this symbiotic relationship between the health of the mother and the health of the baby. And this is what I was watching. And what I saw was that when I looked at the liquid which was coursing through these umbilical cords, it seemed to change consistency. At some stages, it was sparkling and clear and vital, and at those stages, the mother was really vibrant and alive. And at some stages, it looked gunky and sticky like molasses, and then the mother was drooping. And I realized what Teilhard de Chardin had been talking about when he invented the term the noosphere. He talked about a sheath of consciousness that surrounds our planet. So I see several shades. I see, firstly, there's the physiosphere, which is just the rock, the third rock from the sun, just rock matter. And then on top of that, there's a biosphere, which is a sheath of life that surrounds this planet. It's vegetable life, it's animal life, it's human life. And then there's a third sheath, which we call the atmosphere, which is like almost an emotional embrace for our planet. And then Tyler Desjardins talked about a noosphere, which is a sheath of consciousness surrounding that. Now I think there are 3 more shades, but that's for another day. But what I was watching the interaction between the noosphere and the planet, between the universe itself and between planet Earth. And I could see what the effect was. If we poison our atmosphere or poison our noosphere, it is not able to protect us and to sustain us and nurture us. And I got the impression immediately that the quality of the liquid was determined by 3 things. It was determined by the quality of our thinking, by the quality of our speaking, and the quality of our acting. And these were creating the consistency, the clarity, or the gunkiness of what was going through each umbilical cord. And they were having a huge effect. And I realized that as we think and as we speak and as we act, there are different kind of intensities to it. So the thoughts and the words and the actions we engage in are most powerful when they're done repeatedly and with great intensity. So a fleeting thought that I never go back to has very little power to impact anything. But if I go back consistently to a particular thought, a particular statement, or particular kinds of actions, and I do it with ferocious intensity, I have an extraordinary ability to impact the world very, very differently. And if that's true for the individual thoughts and the individual words and the individual actions, what is it like when there's a whole group who regularly goes back to an idea, a thought, a word, or a deed, and approaches it with extraordinary consistency as a group? Then you've got an amazing ability to impact an outcome. And if you take that to its widest possible application, what is it like when you get, as a global community, an idea, or a phrase, or an action that the whole species goes back to with extraordinary frequency and great intensity, then our world changes radically, for the good or for the bad, depending on what the thought is, what the phrase is, or what the actions are. And it's one of the big problems I have with the 9/11 episode, where they showed again and again and again planes smashing into these buildings. It's like, as a global community, we feasted regularly and with extraordinary intensity on a scene that engendered either fear, anger, or revenge in us. And we paid the price. We went into a war with Iraq and Afghanistan as a result of it. When you focus that level of intensity on a thought, an image, a word, or an action, and you do it as a global community, there are extraordinary impacts. When you hold really good thoughts and great affirmations and deeds of love and compassion as a global community, we could become an enlightened globe in literally a week's time if we could organize that. And I think for myself of what has the image of a Jesus stripped naked, dying in agony on a cross, that we hold as an image again and again and again for over 1 billion people on this planet who are Christians right now. What does that image do to us? Holding that thought, making those kinds of affirmations, what does that do? What would it be like if the image of Jesus was of a Christ-conscious being inviting us into an understanding of our own divinity? If there was some image that captured that, and some words that held that, and some actions and disciplines that held that, it would have been a totally different experience. 2,000 years of Christianity would have been a totally different experience. So today, on the eve almost of the inauguration of our next president, several people in the community have asked me over the last few weeks if I would say something about our country and our world and the possibilities ahead of us. And I want to use this image, this notion of the extraordinary power we have as individuals and as communities and as a globe to affect global outcomes. So vis-a-vis the inauguration of President-elect Barack Obama and what our country hopes to achieve over the next 4 years, I want to address that by making 5 points this morning. The first one I will call projection. I want to talk about how we project stuff onto each other. Secondly, I want to talk about leadership. Thirdly, I will call it is not payback time, it is pay forward time. Then I want to talk about American domestic policy, and then finally, American foreign policy. So there are the 5 points I'll try to make this morning. So I want to talk firstly about projection. Any of you who've ever studied psychology, and Jungian psychology in particular, know the phenomenon whereby we tend to project unrecognized aspects of ourselves onto other people, good stuff and bad stuff. And so we are very much in admiration of somebody because we take some ability of our own and we project it on somebody who does it very, very, very well, and we admire them. Or we take something that we're not dealing with in our own shadow material and not recognize it in ourselves, we project it onto another individual or a community or a nation, and then we act against it there. So projection is that phenomenon whereby we take unrecognized material, good or bad in ourselves, and we ascribe it to somebody else. Now it's actually, I believe, slightly more complex than that. So it's not that I'm taking material, unrecognized material, and I'm projecting it onto Tom. I think Tom has a very, very fine mind, and I'm in awe of his mind. So it's not that I'm taking material out of Sean, and I'm projecting it onto Tom. It's more complex. It's that I am taking material from the part of me I recognize as me, and I'm projecting it onto the part of me I think is Tom, because we're not distinct. Each one of us is merely a different articulation of the same basic Homo originalis, the same basic human being. God's experiment with Homo sapiens sapiens has 6.5 billion different articulations, but it's only one experiment. There's only one human species. So basically, projection is the failure to recognize that no matter where I push stuff, it's me. I'm just pushing it onto a different part of the God self. And so, for instance, if I'm a kid sitting inside in a car and I'm eating candy and I roll down the window and I throw the candy wrapper out the window, have I gotten rid of my garbage? Of course I haven't. The garbage is still there. It's just in a different location, but it's still there. If, as a community or a nation, we take all our toxic material and we dump it in China, have we gotten rid of our toxic waste? No. We've just put it someplace else. If, for instance, I had a very serious stomach illness and a very serious lung problem, and I go to the doctor and I find out what it is, and I get really, really upset, and I start mouthing off. I start talking about, I can't believe my stomach did this to me, or my lungs did that to me. So my mouth is bad-mouthing my stomach and my lungs, not realizing that my mouth was what ate the stuff that created the problem for my stomach, and smoked the stuff that created the problem for my lungs. I'd be far better employed to say, okay, we got a problem, guys, and it's a problem of the entire organism. Now, how can the mouth and the stomach and the lungs cooperate in healing all of me? And that's what I believe we have to start doing at this stage. The great power politicians have, or any leader for that matter, the great power that politicians have and the great problems that politicians run into are frequently the result of projections from the populace. So we have to be really, really careful about the quality of our projections. We have to project compassion and love and possibility rather than difficulties onto people, because they will act out that which we lay upon. That's my first point, projection. Second point then I call leadership. Now we know from physics that the entire universe reduces down to energy. The universe consists of energy. If I take something as apparently solid as this bench up here, and I reduce it down to its molecular structure, and then I reduce its molecular structure down to its atomic substructure, and then I take subatomic particles, and then I investigate the subatomic particles, I wind up just literally with energy. There is nothing in the universe, in this physical universe, which is not energy. Everything is energy. Physical stuff is energy, emotions are energy, thoughts are energy, words are energy, actions are energy. And this energy gets projected all over the place. And we do this constantly. I want you to imagine what the Super Bowl is coming up fairly shortly, is it? How many weeks? 2 more weeks, say. Okay. You see, this is a wildly enthusiastic group of footballers here. Okay. I want you to imagine what Super Bowl Sunday would look like if whoever the two teams are who are contesting had to play the game in a high school campus with no audience and no television cameras and no involvement from anybody else, that there's just this bunch of guys out in the field doing their shtick for the Super Bowl. What do you think the energy would be like? It would be a totally different kind of energy. Most of the energy of that encounter has to do with the people who are around it, the 80 or 90,000 participants in the stands shouting their heads off, and people who are drinking their beers and watching their television sets. The energy is being directed. You don't have to be in the physical location to impact energetically what's happening on the field. Everybody, if there are 1 billion people watching that event, all 1 billion, depending on their intensity and the ferocity of their looking at it, they're all impacting the outcome of that thing. So as energy beings, we hugely impact every event that happens. Think about the energy we give to particular dates. Your birthday, for instance. Your birthday is literally, it's just another day in the year, like the other 365. But for some reason, this has a special focus for you. And some of them more particularly, like your 60th birthday party or your 100th birthday party. Everybody gathers around and they all project energy onto the occasion, and it becomes a very special event. But in fact, it's another day on the calendar. But more especially than any place else, we tend to do this with our leaders, our political leaders and our church leaders. We project extraordinary amounts of energy onto these people, which creates their power base and their problems for them. Because the quality of our projection, what it is we're projecting, will influence greatly how they will move. Suppose, for instance, for some reason or other, you decided to project energy onto me, because I'm a leader in a designated field, let's say. And you project energy onto me. Now, if I am a very young soul, and I accept your projections and your energy, and I promise I'm going to give you heaven on earth, and you're really, really happy, I'm definitely going to give you hell on earth instead, because of my own pathology. But initially, it's going to look like heaven on earth, because your narcissism is being engaged by my pathology, and we're building off each other. So if I'm a very immature soul, the more power you give me by your projection, the bigger the problems we're going to create as a group. If, however, you project onto me, for whatever skills I might have, and I were a very, very old soul, then I could really help to bring about, with your projections and your power, I could help to bring around heaven on earth. But initially, it would look very difficult, because I would have to invite every single one of you to work with your own pathology. So it wouldn't look like heaven and earth initially. It would look like a very difficult thing. But eventually, it would bring heaven and earth, because every single one of us would be growing and dealing with our own pathologies. So we have to be very careful on whom we project our stuff. Some people can carry it, and they can identify the light at the core of a culture and amplify that. And other people can only identify the shadow at the core of a culture and amplify that. So we have to be really careful on whom we offer our projections. And I've said to you many times, I believe there are 5 levels of leadership. There are people whom, when they get into positions of authority, they just use it for personal self-aggrandizement. They have no interest whatsoever in anybody except themselves. These are the despots of history. That's the first level. And there's a second level who, when they get into positions of authority, they reward only their backers. They make it good for the people who put them in power, so they can be in power for longer periods of time. That's the second level of leadership. And then the third level of leadership is people who, when they get in positions of power, they only reward those who voted for them. And they have ways of finding out whether you voted for me or not, and we'll help those who voted and we'll ignore those who didn't vote for us. It's a third level of leadership. A fourth level of leadership is where, when a person is elected, they work for all of their constituents, those who voted for them and those who did not vote for them. They work for all their constituents. But none of these are great leaders. The truly great leader is the person who, when they're in a position of authority, they begin to think as global citizens long-term for all life on the planet, not just for all human life, but for all life forms on the planet. These truly are the leaders we want. And these are the kind of leaders we need to put into positions of authority. Those who, when they take on the leadership, even if it's the leadership of America, that they're not just thinking about America, they're thinking about the entire planet and all species in the long term. So that's what leadership looks like, it seems to me. That's my second point. My third point then is, it is not payback time. It is pay forward time. I don't know how many of you saw the movie about 9 or 10 years ago. What was it called? Was it called Pay Forward or Pay Forward? The story of somebody who, instead of paying back debts to people who would loan them money, they decided just to give gifts to total strangers and say to them, here's a gift, gift somebody else at some stage. Give somebody else a gift at some stage. So they call it Pay Forward. That you're giving gifts to people, you're not just paying back what you owed, but you're giving lovingly to somebody else so they can help another person. We need to realize that This is not time for payback. This is not time to begin to screw the people who screwed us in the past, whoever we perceive these to be. It is not about that. It is about making everybody a part of the way forward. Everybody a part of the solution. Now, that doesn't mean that we can ignore the problems or even ignore the problematic people. They need to be confronted and dealt with. But that's very different from exacting revenge and trying to kind of screw them because they screwed us. That can't be the way. We have to participate actively as citizens in this democracy in order to make the dreams come true for America and for the world itself. I've seen in world history so very, very often that people who have wrested freedom from oppressive colonialist regimes and then sat back expecting the goodies to pour into their lap, it falters again and again and again. And it falters on two swords. It falters on the sword of corruption that begins to happen very quickly for the new leadership, and it falters on the sword of people passively and non-participatorily sitting back and waiting for the goodies to arrive. The price of freedom is very high. The price of a dream is very high. If we want freedom and we want our dreams, we have to be actively involved. No one person can do that on their own or carry that for all of us. We have to be totally involved in it. I remember during my time in Kenya, one of the things I got involved in on a regular basis was water production. I was involved with lots of different water projects because water was a huge issue. I lived literally on the equator, so water was a huge problem. And most of the projects went very, very well. Typically, a water project would take about 2 years. By the time you surveyed the terrain and you applied for financing from some organization and you got the pipes and you dug the holes and you covered them in and you did the plumbing, whatever, it was typically about 2 years from conception to completion. And most of these worked excellently, but I remember two of them that failed miserably. And one of them was, we had laid a water pipe for about 8 miles, everything had gone perfectly, and then a warrior from a neighboring tribe who didn't have a water project literally traversed the whole length of the pipe, just jabbing his spear every 5 or 6 paces into it. There was just PVC piping, and smashed it. And we had this big grand ceremony and turning on of the faucet in the village square on the morning of the completion of the faucet, of the project, and nothing happened. And we went back and it was just leaking all over the place. On another project, we did an extraordinary job. We got the water from the source and we turned on the tap in the morning, and everybody danced in the water and drank the water and bathed in the water. And 2 days later, most of the village was down with a disease because we were piping it from a contaminated source. And what that said to me was this: the pipes represent organizations and institutions. And if the organizations and the institutions are leaky or faulty, then you can't deliver to the consumer. But equally, even if the structures are really, really good and the institutions are good, but you're plugged in and the water that's flowing through is contaminated, you're going to poison the citizenry. So that represents for me the people who staff our institutions, whether these are churches, political organizations, or industry. Two things need to happen. We need to be reforming our institutions and we need to be reforming ourselves. Every single one of us needs constant reformation. I'm of the belief system that the law of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, which says that all systems left to their own devices run themselves down into chaos. That's true. But it's also true that more and more complex life forms emerge. And this was a huge problem for science for about 100 years. How can it be that the second law of entropy pertains, that all systems run themselves down into chaos, and at the same time, more and more complex life forms continue to evolve? How can you manage that? And an extraordinary genius called Ilya Prigogine, who was a Belgian biochemist, got the Nobel Prize in 1977 for solving the problem. It was called Dissipative Structures. What he found out was that some systems, when they go into crisis, just collapse and break down. But other systems, when they come into crisis, what they do is they reorganize their internal components into a different configuration, and this allows a jump in consciousness. It's a bit like a football team which is losing badly, and you take the same members of the team and you put them in different positions, and all of a sudden they click. So you're using the same components but in different configurations, and then you get this jump in consciousness. Now, I think that this is what needs to happen in our organizations, in our political system, in our churches, and in ourselves. When we meet times of crisis, instead of falling on our faces pessimistically, we have to reconfigure the resources available to us and jump to a higher, more complex level of organization. So we constantly need to call ourselves as individuals, because we're the water that goes through the pipes, and we need to call our institutions and our organizations, because they're the pipes themselves, to reformation. And this is the function of the prophet, The prophet is the person who can do two things. The prophet is the one who sees really clearly what is, not what appears to be, not what they're told is there, not what they expect to find, but what really is there. They see like the rest of us don't see, and then they invite us back into alignment with this reality. Here is how we need to hold ourselves accountable, and not just expect that one person or one party is going to do this for us. There has to be participatory democracy. We have to be involved in this process of reformation of institutions and reformation of ourselves as individuals. That's my third point. My fourth point then is, I want to have a quick look at American domestic policy. I remember a very famous incident, probably 30 years ago at this stage, when there was an international meeting between the then USSR and the United States of America on human rights. And our delegation left from here to the meeting totally self-righteous that there's going to be a slam dunk, because the Russians were notorious for their civil rights. And we, on the other hand, we had freedom of speech, and we had freedom of assembly, and we had freedom of worship, and we had a free press. We had all these freedoms, and all these, they were repressing these freedoms in the USSR. And the meeting started, and we started doing our self-righteous slam dunking. We thought it was like be over and done with. They'd kind of cowered in front of us and say, "You're absolutely right, we have a terrible track record." They countered instead and said, "Okay, we recognize that you got freedom of press, and freedom of worship, and freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly, but what we see also is that we are guaranteeing that every Russian has housing." Are you guaranteeing that? We are guaranteeing that every Russian has education. Are you guaranteeing that? We are guaranteeing that every Russian has access to health care. Are you guaranteeing that? We're guaranteeing that every Russian has employment. Are you guys guaranteeing that? And what we can see, of course, is there are different definitions of human rights. The truth is, both of them are right. What we had was working beautifully, and there were things we had which were not working at all. There were things that they were working very well, and there were things that weren't working at all for them. So when I look at American domestic policy, I have the following kind of wish list, or the following ideas. The first thing I think is, I would really love to see us cleaning up our voting process. If we can't be sure that the person I'm actually voting for is getting my vote, there's not a whole lot of point in voting. So to make sure that there is definitely a trail, a voting trail, whatever kind of machinery we use or whatever technique we use, that there's accountability, that we're voting for the person we want to vote for and it's being recorded accordingly. I would love to see the lobbyist movement done away with. That some people, because they have the money and the resources, can hugely influence American policies domestically and foreign policy just because they got the bucks to do it. That needs to be done away with. Every citizen needs to have equal access to an equal voice in where we go as a nation in our domestic policy and in our foreign policy. And certainly the extraordinary cost of what it takes to get elected to any position in this country, including the presidency, there's something crazy about that. That only people who are extraordinary organisers and can create that kind of money, or who own that kind of money, are in positions where they can be elected. There must be a lot of people out there with this skill set to be great leaders, but they don't have the money, and they're not prepared to base themselves to lobbyists in order to achieve office. We need to be doing something about that. When I look at our record around human rights, we have freedom of assembly, we have free press, we got freedom to practice our religion, all those are good. But there has been a blurring, in my estimation, in the separations that need to exist and that historically did exist in our land. The separation of church and state is beginning to blur, where there's an inappropriate influence from fundamentalist Christianity on the policies of our country. That has begun to blur. I think there's been a blurring. The press in our country is not as free as it used to be, because it's more and more amalgamated in the hands of smaller and smaller little cartels. That needs to be dealt with. You cannot have a free country if the truth cannot be spoken widely with all the varying perspectives and viewpoints. So there needs to be separation between the state and the press. There needs to be separation between science and the state. More and more, even government scientists are being dictated to what their results must be. They're making the results coincide with the government agenda rather than creating a government agenda based on real science. That has to end. And certainly the blurring between the three levels of our government, between the judiciary, the legislative branch, and the executive branch, that has definitely been blurring in our times. All of these need to be re-separated. And then when you look at what the Russians said to us, We have to look at our housing situation. How can it be that in the richest country of the world, most people can't even own their own homes? The homes are owned by banks. How can that be? That something as basic a human right as owning a home to live in, that we can't afford to do that they're owned by banks, and that so many Americans are going into foreclosure and no longer being able to own their homes or even inhabit their own homes. That stinks. Something needs to be done about that. The Russians were right. And when you look at our health situation, how can it be that 10 million American children have no health insurance? How can that be in a country like ours? Or how can it be that the health insurance companies get to write their own laws? Or how can it be that the pharmaceutical companies get to name their own prices for the drugs? And how can it be that we're going through an epidemic of obesity in our country because of our addiction to fast food? What needs to be done? Where's health there when our little kids are bloated because they're not exercising and they're eating French fries and burgers, most of the day? So it needs a serious look at the health of our nation. We need to take a serious look at our employment opportunities. For any country to say to any one of its citizens, we don't need you, instead of pointing and saying, your country needs you, we're saying, your country doesn't need you. That you have no skill set that we need. The discrepancy between the pay, the discrepancy at the moment between your average CEO and a minimum wage worker is 401 to 1. Your average CEO is earning 401 times more than your minimum wage worker. For a person who's doing hours almost as long. Now, I have nothing against this lady who's just taking over as CEO in Yahoo, but I happen to know that her salary, when you look at her stocks and her options, is going to be in the region of about $30 million this year. There's something wrong about that. At the same time, when millions and millions of Americans are going to be rendered homeless and jobless, we need to be looking at how we pay and how we engage our population. And look at our education system. Again, we see that depending on which city a child is born in, they have great opportunities for education or they have no opportunities for education. And that the education itself is preparing kids not for life, but merely for jobs. To think that education is about just creating technical experts in particular fields rather than educating kids so they have a sense of curiosity and awe at planet Earth is terrible. A whole relook at education needs to take place. So that's my wish list for our domestic policy. And finally, my wish list for our American foreign policy is to come to the realization that we are ipso facto, right now, we are an empire. We are the only empire in the world right now. All of the other great empires have fallen. We are de facto the only empire. We've transitioned from a republic to an empire. Now, my hope is that we will be the last empire on the planet. Not that our empire will last forever and thus be the last, but rather that we will regard this as a temporary privilege, a transitionary period in world self-governance, so that we, because we have the resources, both the personnel, the education and the finances, that we begin creating a style of life on planet Earth which really nurtures every single person on the planet. We have the opportunity for doing this as a country. That we need to look at the global issues that face us as a world community, whether it's global warming, if you subscribe to that, or it's the greenhouse gases, or whether you're thinking about poverty, or illness, or economic, or ecological degradation, whatever it is, that we have the resources and the leadership to begin addressing these and to lead the world into a different kind of thinking about these. That we need to very seriously begin looking at our refusal to take part in international treaties that 95% of the countries of the world have signed up for, like the Kyoto Accord, or like not using torture, or the European, or the Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice, which we have refused to honour. We need to begin becoming citizens of planet Earth. Now, while that process is taking place, what I would hate to see happen, I would hate to see ever a one world government. It is much easier for an oligarchy to take control of an organization like that than it is for it to take control of 200 different countries. Moreover, if we were all just blended clones of each other, life would be very, very boring. We would just be robots. And if there were only one government on the world, we would be robotic in our cultures. We need the cultural creativity of the 200 different nations and the 5,000 different languages and subcultures on our planet. That gives creativity and flavour to it. I would hate to see ever there being a one world government. There needs to be participation, there needs to be alignment, there needs to be some working with each other, but not one person or one organisation having total control of the planet. Finally, in conclusion, I would like to say this. And I'm going to use Barack Obama as a symbol because, in a sense, he carries extraordinary projections from us as Americans and even for the world community. So I'm going to use him as a symbol for the last kind of prayer I make for our world and for our country this morning. I say this in two phases. Firstly, do not ask what Barack Obama can do for you. Ask rather what you can do for Barack Obama. And then secondly, do not ask what the world can do for Barack Obama. Ask what Barack Obama can do for the world.